Hello and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and in this video I will be doing a series review for the Southern Reach trilogy written by Jeff Vandermeer. This trilogy is made up of Book 1, Annihilation, Book 2, Authority, and Book 3, Acceptance. I first read the Southern Reach in 2017 and it became one of my all-time favorite works of science fiction literature. I mentioned it in my top 10 science fiction favorites video, if you want to check that out, and it seemed only logical I should make a dedicated series review for it once I'd reread it this year. I'm not sure I'll title it as such, in fact I'm pretty sure I won't, but you can also technically consider this a rave series review because the Southern Reach is most definitely still an all-time science fiction favorite. Though more specifically, the Southern Reach is weird science fiction. Jeff Vandermeer is one of weird fiction's most prominent contemporary authors after all, alongside China Mieville, another favorite of mine, as you know if you've been watching me for a while now. So it's weird science fiction with a good dose of body, psychological, and cosmic horror added into the mix as well, and with a focus on the environment as an uncanny world-building and theme-delivering element. Unlike the Ambergris trilogy, the Southern Reach is what I'll call a traditional or linked series, i.e. books 2 and 3 directly continue the story and thematic exploration started in book 1, and you do need to read book 1 in order to read books 2 and 3. Book 1, Annihilation, however, can be read and thoroughly enjoyed as a standalone. Each book does have its own vibe though. Annihilation works as a mind-bending, what-the-fucky and confusing mystery with strong horror elements and a very introspective main character called the Biologist. Authority Book 2 functions more as a spy thriller and takes place outside of Area X, the mysterious and uncanny environment at the heart of the Southern Reach, but links back to and furthers the story initiated in book 1. Finally, Acceptance, book 3, mixes tonal notes from the previous 2 books and wraps everything up as satisfyingly as possible. Now I'll give a brief, shortish synopsis for the trilogy. So there exists somewhere in the southern United States, I'd even say southeastern US, think Florida or Louisiana, a zone of pristine wilderness called Area X that appeared out of the blue a few decades before the start of Book 1, Annihilation, and which is encircled by a border that can only be traversed through one specific spot and is guarded by the military. Very strange, disturbing, and seemingly impossible things happened and keep happening inside of Area X, and the Southern Reach, an intelligence agency under the aegis of either the CIA or the NSA, basically, though it is never named as either, was set up to study and try to understand it, and perhaps to defend against it. To this effect, it has been sending manned expeditions into Area X for years and years with little to show for it, and the story of the Southern Reach trilogy with Annihilation starts as the all-female 12th expedition is sent into Area X. I praised Vandermeer's delicious prose in my review of his Ambergris books, or at least the first 2 books in the trilogy, which you can check out if you wish, and remarked that it was a lot more elaborate and, for lack of a better word, literary than it was in either his Bourne-verse novels or the Southern Reach. And I stand by that assessment, but that doesn't mean the writing here was bad, not at all. It was precise, expressive, and meaningful when it needed to be, especially when describing the natural landscape of Area X. Each book is divided in named parts, and each part is divided in named chapters. Not something I necessarily see a lot of anymore in my fiction, actually, especially as an adult reader. The pacing felt relatively similar in all 3 novels, though I suppose the very first, Annihilation, reads the most quickly overall, if only because you just want to know what the hell is going to happen next, hoping to get answers to the weirdness unfolding around the main character, or one main character and the adjacent characters. The second and third book could also, as a result, be perceived as being slower paced, but that is because they need to cover a lot more world-building ground than book 1, obviously. Books 1 and 2 are single point-of-view stories. You get the biologists in Annihilation, and an intelligence agent who becomes the director of the Southern Reach, named Controls in Authority. In book 3, Acceptance, however, you get several points of view and 3 separate timelines, one in the present and 2 in the past at different times, which I think was justified and necessary to wrap things up with regards to the overarching story and mystery of Area X. Also, I would agree with our readers that book 2 is perhaps the weakest. Does it suffer from middle book syndrome? You be the judge of that. I still thoroughly enjoyed it, but yes, be aware of that. Now, I wouldn't specifically call the Southern Reach character-driven as such, but the trilogy does feature memorable characters, such as the biologist, a woman who takes easily, or more easily than her colleagues or fellow expedition mates, to Area X and allows the reader to see its beauty alongside its horror through her peculiar eyes, or, her peculiar perception of things, opinion on things. Things like that. I personally think she can also be read as autistic or more broadly neurodivergent, but I know she wasn't specifically written that way, so it's an entirely personal thing. An ecologist uniquely suited for the 12th expedition into Area X, the reader never learns her first name or the first name of the other expedition members except one later on in the trilogy, yet resides in her head during the entirety of Annihilation's unfolding story, and you become intimately familiar with her as a result. In Book 2, Authority, you are introduced to new characters that remain in Book 3, Acceptance, including Control, whose real name is John Rodriguez, an intelligence agent hired to become the new director of the Southern Reach. Control is more of a normie than the biologist, or even some of the secondary characters you encounter along the story, but I personally think he is meant really to represent, more so than other characters, humanities as a whole struggle to comprehend the phenomenon of Area X. His very name, Control, is also somewhat ironic, as he is largely a pawn controlled by others and struggles to retain control of the situation unfolding at the Southern Reach. That's playing around with words and meaning. Yes, he is an overall weaker character in my opinion, but still elicits compassion from the reader most definitely. Finally, secondary characters including strong personalities, unwilling victims is what I'll call them, and ambiguous leader figures also keep the story rolling and provide additional confused and very human perspectives in the face of Area X's mystery and possible threat. Every character, as I see it, is a facet, represents a facet of humanity trying to apprehend something that is potentially fundamentally unknowable. The Southern Reach's world building and theming, I might add, relies on the fact that as human beings, we will never fully understand the mystery of Area X. But as readers, we can certainly find enjoyment in trying to, with the various disparate elements we are given throughout the trilogy. Or at least that's certainly what I did back in 2017 when I first read it. Witness here the numerous notes I took and copied from discussion posts on Goodreads. As such, you can't really apply adjectives like realistic or believable to the world building of these books. Yes, it is science fiction in the sense it plays around with ecological and biological transformations, or things like mimicry and cloning, possibly. It also features a main character who is a biologist, and there are other secondary, tertiary characters who are scientists, but there aren't any hard answers one can analyze too finely or closely, and that's kind of the point. Still, it's fun, engaging at the least, because you're doing it alongside them, to see all the characters at the Southern Reach trying to find rational, science-based explanations for Area X. Control, the main character of Authority, confronts the former director with the question, why haven't you considered aliens? Half seriously, and have to psych her out a bit. And she replies, just deadpan, what makes you think we haven't? This exchange is meant to convey several things: discomfort, confusion, character interaction, psychological manipulation, but it's also honest, because the simple fact is the scientists at the Southern Reach have considered pretty much every possible explanation. Also, be prepared to see the word and concept of terroir used more than you have ever seen before. I mentioned ecological and biological transformations, aliens, etc. That is the essence of the Southern Reach's science fictional and horror world building, playing with the presence of the uncanny in nature, making nature itself uncanny through small details that accumulate and escalate in their weirdness and, I want to say, out of placeness. This lends a very specific and highly flavorful atmosphere to the trilogy, one that is equally, in my opinion, haunting and beautiful. The Southern Reach indeed does a brilliant job of blending horror and beauty, which is kind of a running theme for Jeff Vandermeer and China Mieville as well. So, yeah. Speaking of horror though, The Southern Reach is also brilliantly creepy and features cosmic, body, and psychological horror elements. The cosmic horror is ultimately derived from the unknowableness of Area X, whereas the body and psychological horror is more spread out through various scenes and situations the characters encounter. Several twisty what the fuck moments kept me on my toes, turning the page until late at night. I just couldn't stop, even as I was thoroughly creeped out. One moment in Authority in particular gave me goosebumps, it was so intense, or rather, rendered intense by how much I was immersed in the story. It was late at night, there was a thunderstorm outside, and yeah, I just read through that passage and it was like, it really got to me. Finally, I'll add that Authority and Acceptance feature what I'll call spy novel intelligence agency shenanigans. These were enjoyable on their own, but I also think they serve more importantly as a mirror to the mystery and complexity of Area X, because the Southern Reach and the central it answers to, that's why I think it's supposed to be like the CIA or the NSA or something like that, are labyrinthine messes full of shadowy figures who withhold information, misdirect, and manipulate others. It all becomes nearly as unknowable and ununderstandable as Area X itself, ironically enough. In that respect, it's not dissimilar to Boris and Arkady Strugatsky's Snail on the Slope, where a strange forest and an institute set up to understand it are continually paralleled and compared to one another. Though, I didn't really like that novel ultimately, just as an FYI. Let's take a look at the themes now. If I wasn't implying this obviously enough from the get-go, let me make this clear. The Southern Reach is very rich thematically because all-time favorites of mine couldn't possibly be anything but that. First, there's the possibly too obvious theme of humankind versus nature, or in this case, I suppose one should more accurately say humankind versus nature embedded within alien nature? Then again, if you think about it, alien organisms and/or biological phenomena, if they exist, they probably do somewhere in the universe, would technically be part of nature, but, I digress. Another debate for another day. So humans versus nature / alien nature, trying to make sense of the things they do not, and possibly cannot, understand. This is where the cosmic horror comes in, like I said, where the alienation, comes in. What we do not know or understand, we tend to be afraid of. Lovecraft had it very right in that regard, even if we also find it fascinating or beautiful, which is more or less the biologist's perspective. Of course, you can add an environmentalist undertone to this theme as well, and environmentalist concerns definitely permeate other works by Vandermeer, such as Venice Underground and the Bourneverse novels. Area X, even though it is weird and horrific at times, is also described as being pristine, in a state completely devoid of human-made pollution. The biologist is more precisely an ecologist, feels closer to wild places than she does to other humans, and wonders at times if Area X expanding is such a bad thing after all, given what we as a species are doing to planet Earth. There is a keening, metaphorical note of wanting to reconcile Homo sapiens with its wild, deeply animal origins, and not just origins since we are animals, period. And the sad realization only an alien entity like Area X might be able to make that happen. The second, and strangely related to the humankind versus nature theme, is grief, on multiple levels. The biologist and Control, and other key characters, look back on their experiences and the complicated relationships they had with loved ones with a lot of regret and deep grief. This grief then becomes entwined with the grief and regret they, and other characters, experience in the face of Area X, all that they cannot know about it, and the little they can actually do about it. Book 3, in that sense, is perfectly titled Acceptance. It is most certainly about accepting, surrendering to even Area X, but I believe it also applies to each character on a more deeply personal level. Accepting loss, accepting change. On that note, a third theme I would point to is change and how it interacts with identity. Area X is all about change and transformations. Metaphorical, psychological transformations, but also literal, sometimes horrific, physical transformations. It messes with identity as well, precisely because of said changes, and because of the way it employs mimicry to interact with the creatures within its boundary and outside of it. The main characters go through important changes, realizations, and sometimes literal transformations that reshape what they are and who they are, or perhaps their transformations finally align more accurately who and what they are. I'll let you ponder that one. Identity is also explored through the process of cloning, but I can't really say more without spoiling book 2, so you'll have to discover that for yourselves. Change is also very directly discussed through transitional environments, transitional ecosystems, which the biologist is an expert in, and which Area X, encompassing forests, marshland, and a length of coastline, is as well. Reclaimed building sites, tidal pools, and wetlands are all used to explore the idea of liminal, dynamic, ecological environmental spaces where organisms live in two worlds at once and are neither strictly one thing or the other. In fact, Area X's border itself can be considered a liminal space with its own uncanny properties the Southern Reach desperately tries to pin down. Finally, communication and sense-making are also discussed and explored throughout the trilogy. Humans try to make sense of Area X, yes, but they also, to no avail I might add, try to figure out if Area X is trying to communicate with them and attempt to communicate back, all the while knowing such a thing may be impossible ultimately. Therefore, the Southern Reach employs psychologists and linguists, as well as biologists, chemists, physicists. Everyone is certain there is communication going on because everything in nature does in fact communicate in one way or another. Even plants, they use, chemical compounds to communicate with one another. But what is less than certain though is whether humans could ever make heads or tails of the message being communicated by Area X. Language is a form of communication. It's our specialty as human beings, but not all communication is done through language. Confer the plant example I just mentioned. In the Southern Reach, you'll encounter people being used, perhaps, as cellular messengers, hormones, even according to one character. More crucially though, you'll encounter a creepy message, scribbled on the insides of a breathing tower that digs into the ground. Yes, a tower, into the ground, and oh lordy, that message. It is a central leitmotif of the trilogy, and I had fun in 2017 copying all of it down because I'm a nerd like that. But you have to ask yourself, is it ever actually meant to say something cogent? A linguist actually directly asks this question at one point in Authority. Is there meaning to the words? Is there meaning to the material used to make the words? If there is meaning, a message, does it lie within the words, within the writing itself, what it's made out of, or simply in the fact it was written at all? Of course, readers will have stronger opinions one way or another when they know who exactly is creating the writing, but even then, there is no solid answer provided or to be found ultimately, and once again, that is kind of the point. Some concluding remarks. Yes, I have seen the movie adaptation of Annihilation, and I loathed it. It was beautiful visually, yes. It had something of Annihilation's spirit in its creepy and confusing tone and atmospheres, sure, but it is absolutely not a faithful adaptation. It was dumbed down as all hell, and the fact Area X is destroyed at the end of the movie, yes, It's a major spoiler, but I don't care because that movie is garbage, as far as I'm concerned. Absolutely infuriated me. It's honestly in my top 3 of worst adaptations ever made, alongside Aragon and the last seasons of Game of Thrones. Yes, I consider it that bad. Now, I've seen The Southern Reach, and Annihilation in particular, compared to Solaris, written by Stanislav Lem, and Roadside Picnic, written by the Strugatsky brothers. I have read both of those books, and I would consider that yes, there are some similarities in premise to Roadside Picnic. Okay. Though, like I mentioned earlier, The Snail on the Slope of the Strugatsky's oeuvre fits the bill more, definitely. And yes, there are mild tonal and thematic similarities to Solaris. However, in my opinion, in terms of premise, atmosphere, and cosmic horror, the most similar story to The Southern Reach I've read is The Color Out of Space, written by none other than H.P. Lovecraft. And, as a matter of fact, it is my favorite Lovecraft story. QED. And as an additional note, I would also personally recommend checking out Embassy Town by China Mieville if you have read The Southern Reach and you particularly vibed with the communication and making sense of the alien themes in it. It's an absolutely brilliant novel, and, well, yes, I am biased because it is one of my favorite science fiction books of all time as well. So, all in all, I am very glad I reread The Southern Reach, even though unfortunately I did it at a terrible, abysmal time in my life and didn't enjoy it emotionally as much as I should have. Despite that, however, I now have an even greater appreciation for the series, for Annihilation as an optional standalone, and for Acceptance as a series conclusion. Rereading the series allowed me to find new depths within it, and also to realize that you do get more answers, despite everything I said, than I'd remembered by the end of it, though ultimately, Area X does remain a beautiful and horrific mystery, as it should. So yes, it is most definitely still an all-time science fiction favorite of mine. On that concluding note, I hope you found this review interesting, informative, engaging. Sorry it took so long, and I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all in another video. Bye-bye.